The alarms were already screaming when I opened my eyes. I did not have time to ask what was happening. The wall beside my bed cracked open like an egg, and the night sky of Kepler's Rest was suddenly not dark anymore. It was orange. It was moving. I remember thinking, in that first stupid half-second, that the sun had somehow risen in the wrong direction. Then the sound reached me, and I understood that the light was not the sun. It was fire, falling from the sky in long straight lines, the kind of fire that does not occur in nature. My name is Daniel Cole. I was 26 years old, and I worked in the water reclamation station on the eastern ridge of the colony. Nothing about my life had prepared me to survive what came next, but somehow I did. I grabbed my sister Claire by the arm before she even finished waking up. She was 19, still half dreaming, asking me why the windows were glowing. I did not answer her. I pulled her out of the house and into the street, where our neighbors were already running in every direction, shouting names, looking for children, looking for parents, looking for anyone who could tell them what was falling from the sky. I looked up once. I should not have. Above us, where our small moon usually sat quiet and gray, there were now shapes. Long, dark, angular shapes. Dozens of them, spread across the sky like a net someone had thrown over our world. They were not moving fast. They did not need to. We had no way to fight back, and they knew it. Kepler's Rest was not a military colony. We were 14,000 farmers, engineers, teachers, and families who had come out to the edge of human space to build something quiet. We had a trade agreement with 3 neighboring species. We had never fired a weapon at anyone. We believed, foolishly, that peace was a thing you could earn simply by asking for it. The ships above us did not ask for anything. I do not fully understand, even now, why the Thessari Empire chose our colony that night. Some say it was a resource dispute over the mineral fields to the north. Some say it was a message meant for someone else entirely, and we simply happened to be standing in the way. I have stopped trying to find a reason that makes sense, because there isn't one. There rarely is, when someone decides your life matters less than their convenience. Claire and I ran toward the transport hangar at the edge of town, the only place with ships that could actually leave the atmosphere. Around us, the ground kept lighting up in flashes, each one followed by a deep sound that I felt in my chest before I heard it in my ears. Buildings that had stood for 30 years came down in seconds. The old grain tower, the one every child in the colony had climbed at least once, folded sideways, and was gone before I could even feel sad about it. A man named Oliver Bennett was already at the hangar when we arrived, waving at anyone who came close. He had been a shuttle pilot for the mining survey teams, and that night, that ordinary job made him the most important person on the planet. Get in, there's room for 6 more, he shouted, and I remember how strange it was that his voice sounded almost calm, like he was calling out bus seats instead of the last chance dozens of us would ever have. Claire and I climbed aboard along with 4 others, a mother holding 2 small children, and an older woman named Grace, who kept saying, over and over, that she had left her medication at home, as if that still mattered. I held her hand and told her it would be fine. I did not believe it, but I said it anyway, because sometimes a kind lie is the only thing you have left to give someone. The hangar doors opened, and Oliver pushed the shuttle up faster than I think it was designed to go. Through the small side window, I watched Kepler's Rest fall away beneath us, and for one moment I saw the whole shape of the disaster at once. Fires spread across the northern fields. The lake near the old Harvest Festival grounds had turned the color of rust. Smoke rose in columns, thick enough to blot out entire districts. I did not cry. I want to say I did, because it feels like the human thing to do, but the truth is I simply went numb. There is a kind of fear that is too large to feel properly in the moment. It waits for later. It waits until you are safe enough to fall apart, and then it takes its payment in full. We cleared the atmosphere just as 2 of the Thessari ships began turning in our direction. Oliver did not wait to see what they intended. He threw the shuttle into a hard climb, using the planet's own curve as cover, weaving between debris that used to be one of our small orbital relay stations. I gripped the armrest so tightly my knuckles went white, and I whispered every prayer I could remember, most of them badly, because I had never needed them before that night. Somehow, the two ships did not follow. Perhaps we were too small to matter to them. Perhaps they had bigger targets in mind. I will never know, and I have made peace with not knowing. Behind us, Kepler's Rest kept burning. I watched it through the rear display until the curve of the planet swallowed the sight, and even then, I kept staring at the empty space where my home used to be, as if staring hard enough could undo what had already been done. There were 9 of us on that shuttle. 9 out of 14,000. Oliver set a course for the edge of Sol territory, the closest region of confirmed human protection, nearly 3 days away at full burn. He did not sleep during that time. None of us really did. We took turns holding the mother's children while she rested. We rationed the small amount of food and water aboard, and we listened to the emergency channel loop the same automated warning again and again, because no living voice had yet come to explain what any of us should do next. On the second day, I finally asked Oliver the question that had been sitting in my throat since we left the atmosphere. Why us? Why our colony? We never did anything to them. He kept his eyes on the controls for a long moment before answering. Doesn't matter why, not right now, he said. What matters is somebody out there needs to know what happened here. That's the only job we've got left. Get the story to Earth. I did not understand yet what that meant. I thought he meant it as comfort, a way to give our survival some purpose beyond luck. I did not know that the message we carried would end up changing the shape of the galaxy. On the third day, our sensors finally picked up a signal boundary, the outer edge of a Terran monitoring network. Oliver opened every channel we had and sent the same message on a loop, his voice steady even though I could see his hands shaking on the console. This is civilian transport Halyard 9, out of the colony of Kepler's Rest. Our world has been attacked without warning by Thessari forces. We do not know how many survivors remain. We are requesting immediate assistance and asking that this message be delivered to Terran Command as Priority 1. For nearly 6 hours there was only silence in return. I remember sitting beside the window, watching the old woman named Grace finally fall into a real sleep, her breathing slow, and even for the first time since we had left. The 2 children had stopped crying, worn out from fear, and their mother sat with her back against the wall, staring at nothing. Then, quietly, a response came through. A single voice, calm and formal, identifying itself as a Terran Defense Fleet relay station. It confirmed receipt of our distress call. It told us to hold our current course. It told us that a retrieval ship was already being routed toward our position. And then it said something that none of us expected, something that Oliver repeated to himself under his breath like he could not quite believe it. Message received and logged under Kepler's Rest incident. Command has been notified. Stand by. I did not know, in that moment, exactly what those words meant. I only knew that somewhere far away, on a planet none of us aboard that shuttle had ever set foot on, people were now aware that 14,000 human lives had been erased in a single night. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion of 3 days without real sleep finally catch up to me. I thought our part in this story was over. I thought the worst was behind us, and that all that remained was grief, paperwork, and the slow work of rebuilding somewhere new. I had no idea that our small, battered shuttle, carrying 9 survivors and 1 broken message, was about to become the spark that ended an empire. The retrieval ship met us 18 hours later, a sleek gray vessel bearing the insignia of the Terran Defense Fleet. Its crew moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, wrapping blankets around the children, checking the older woman's condition, asking each of us gentle but precise questions about what we had seen. I remember one young officer kneeling beside me, notebook in hand, asking me to describe the ships in the sky exactly as I remembered them. I told him everything, the shapes, the number, the direction they had come from, the way the sky had turned the color of a wound. He wrote it all down without a single flicker of emotion crossing his face, and only once, right before he stood to leave, did he say something that stayed with me for a very long time. "Thank you for telling us," he said. "This is going to matter more than you know." I did not understand him then. Later that night, as the retrieval ship carried us deeper into Sol territory, I stood in a narrow observation corridor and watched the stars slide past, unfamiliar and cold. Claire found me there. She had barely spoken since we left the colony, and when she finally did, her voice was smaller than I remembered it. "Do you think anyone will even believe us?" she asked. 14,000 people, gone in a single night, and we're the only ones who saw it happen. I did not have an answer for her then. I only put my arm around her shoulders and told her that somebody would listen, because somebody had to. I did not know yet how right that small, hopeful guess would turn out to be. I understand him now. The Terran assembly chamber was the quietest room I had ever stood in, and that silence frightened me more than the noise of the attack ever had. I had been brought to Earth 11 days after the retrieval ship found us, flown in under a kind of careful, gentle secrecy that I did not fully understand at the time. Claire stayed behind at a resettlement center with the others from our shuttle, and I was told that my testimony was needed directly, in person, before the highest levels of Terran leadership. I remember stepping into that chamber and feeling impossibly small. Rows of officials sat in a wide half-circle, their faces lit by soft white light, their attention fixed entirely on me. At the center of the front row sat a woman named Grace Lawton, an admiral of the Terran Defense Fleet, her uniform simple, her expression unreadable. I would come to learn that she was one of the few people on Earth who fully understood what was about to happen, and one of the few who had spent her entire career preparing for it. "Please," she said, her voice calm and even, "tell us what you saw, in your own words. Take whatever time you need." So I told them. I told them about the fire in the sky, about the shapes above our moon, about running through streets that had stood peacefully for 30 years and would not stand for 30 more minutes. I told them about Oliver, about Claire, about the old woman named Grace who had cried over forgotten medication while our world burned behind her. I told them about the 9 of us who made it out and the 14,000 who did not. When I finished, nobody spoke for a long moment. I expected shouting. I expected outrage, or grief, or at the very least some visible reaction. Instead, I saw something else entirely, something that unsettled me far more than anger would have. I saw people nodding slowly, as if confirming something they had long feared but hoped to never witness. Admiral Lawton finally broke the silence. "Thank you, Daniel. What you have described matches other fragments of data we have already gathered from long-range sensors near the Kepler system. I want you to know that your account, and the accounts of the others aboard that shuttle, will be treated as the single most important testimony this assembly has received in over a century." A man near the back of the chamber, one of the civilian representatives, finally spoke, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "A century? Admiral, we are talking about the loss of an entire colony. 14,000 people. Surely this deserves more than historical comparison." Admiral Lawton turned toward him, and her voice remained level, though something in it had hardened. "I am not comparing this to make it smaller," she said. "I am comparing it because it tells us exactly what must happen next." That was the moment the room changed. I did not understand the weight of her words yet, but I felt it settle over the chamber like a held breath. She turned back to the wider assembly and began to explain something that very few outside of Terran High Command had ever heard spoken aloud. 200 years ago, she said, before humanity ever left our own solar system in meaningful numbers, we fought wars among ourselves that nearly ended us as a species. We do not talk about those years often, because the lessons from them are not comfortable. But one lesson survived every government, every reform, every generation that came after. It is this: when a line is drawn and never enforced, it stops being a line at all. It becomes an invitation. When humanity finally reached the stars and began meeting other species, our leaders faced a choice. We could present ourselves as harmless, hoping that kindness alone would protect our colonies from every ambitious empire we encountered. Or we could quietly build something else entirely, something we hoped we would never have to use, but that we swore we would use in full if the day ever came that another power tested us with violence against an undefended human world. A representative near the front asked the question that I imagine everyone in that chamber was thinking. What exactly did we build? Admiral Lawton's answer was simple, but it landed with the weight of a verdict. A promise, she said, written into Terran defense doctrine over 140 years ago and reaffirmed by every government since, regardless of politics or party. It states that any unprovoked attack on a human civilian settlement will be answered not with equal force, but with total and permanent removal of the offending power's ability to ever threaten another human world again. Not punishment, not retaliation in the ordinary sense. Removal. The chamber went silent again, and I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. For over a century, she continued, we have never needed to invoke it, because no power has ever been foolish enough or cruel enough to attack an undefended human colony directly. Until now. I sat there, still exhausted, still grieving, and slowly began to understand what Oliver had meant on that shuttle, 3 days out from a burning planet, when he told me that our job was simply to get the story told. We were not the survivors of a tragedy that would be quietly mourned and slowly forgotten. We were the trigger. Over the following days, I was kept in a modest but comfortable residence near the assembly grounds, along with the other survivors who had been brought to Earth for testimony. I met a woman named Megan Ashford, who had lost her husband and both parents in the attack, and a boy no older than 15 named Ethan Marsh, whose entire family had been in the Northern District when the first strikes came down. Each of us carried a different piece of the same broken night, and each of us, in our own private way, was being asked to relive it publicly, over and over, so that the leaders of Earth could understand exactly what had happened to Kepler's rest. I will admit that some part of me resented it at first. Grief does not want an audience. It wants quiet, and time, and the space to fall apart without being watched. But I began to understand that our testimony was not being collected out of cold procedure. It was being collected because Terran Command wanted to be absolutely certain, beyond any possible doubt, that what they were about to do was justified beyond question, and that history would never be able to claim otherwise. On the 5th day, Admiral Lawton visited the residence where we were staying, without the formality of the assembly chamber around her. She sat with us in a plain room, no uniforms of rank on display, no officials taking notes, and she spoke to us, not as witnesses, but as people. I want you to understand something, she said, looking around at each of us in turn. What is coming will not undo what happened to your home. Nothing can do that. I will not insult your grief by pretending otherwise. She paused, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something soften in her expression. But I need you to know that you were not forgotten the moment your shuttle reached soul space. Every name lost on Kepler's rest has already been recorded, and every name will be read publicly before this is finished. Your colony will not become a footnote. It will become the reason an empire remembers, forever, what happens when it mistakes human patience for human weakness. Megan asked the question that had clearly been sitting heavy in all of our minds. Will this stop them from doing it again, to someone else? Admiral Lawton did not offer comforting exaggeration. She simply told the truth. I cannot promise you that no one will ever attack a human colony again, she said, but I can promise you that whoever tries will not exist long enough to attempt it a second time. That is the only kind of promise that has ever meant anything to the powers who respect nothing but strength. I left that conversation with a strange, uneasy kind of peace. It was not comfort exactly. It was closer to resolve. The empty ache of losing my home and so many of the people I had grown up around had not lessened, and I do not think it ever fully will. But for the first time since the sky had turned orange over Kepler's rest, I understood that our loss was not going to simply vanish into silence. Word of what had happened to our colony spread quickly once the assembly released a formal statement to the wider Terran public. I watched the broadcast from the residence, sitting beside Ethan, who had barely spoken since arriving on Earth. The announcement was simple, almost restrained in tone, but the reaction across human space was anything but quiet. Within hours, I was told that every shipyard across Terran territory, many of which the public had believed to be inactive or purely ceremonial, had received a single coded activation order. I did not yet understand what that order meant, or how long humanity had been quietly preparing for a day exactly like this one. I only knew that somewhere far beyond Earth's atmosphere, our neighboring species, allies and rivals alike, were beginning to notice something they had never truly witnessed before. They were beginning to notice Earth waking up. That evening, I sat with Megan and Ethan in the common room of the residence, none of us speaking much, the broadcast still playing quietly in the background. Ethan finally asked the question that none of the adults around him had dared to ask out loud. Is this our fault? If we hadn't made it out, would any of this be happening? I told him no, as firmly as I could manage. I told him that the fault belonged entirely to the Empire that had chosen to attack an undefended world, and that surviving to tell the truth about it was not a burden to carry guilt over. It was, if anything, the only good thing to come out of that terrible night. He did not look fully convinced, but he nodded, and for the first time since arriving on Earth, he allowed himself to cry openly, without shame, while Megan held his hand and I sat quietly beside them both, letting the grief finally have its moment. I had never seen a shipyard the size of the one built in orbit above Ceres, and nothing in my life had prepared me for what it looked like when it came fully alive. 3 weeks after my testimony before the assembly, I was asked to stay on as a civilian liaison, someone who could speak plainly about what had happened to Kepler's rest whenever officers or engineers needed a human reminder of why any of this mattered. I did not feel qualified for the role, but I said yes anyway, because staying busy was easier than sitting still with my grief. That was how I found myself aboard a transport, heading toward the Ceres shipyard, watching through a wide viewport as structures I had always assumed were simple mining platforms revealed themselves to be something else entirely. Massive docking arms unfolded from what looked like ordinary asteroid outposts. Hidden hangar doors, camouflaged for over a decade under mining permits and commercial cover stories, slid open to reveal warships in various stages of readiness, vessels the public had never known existed. An engineer named Natalie Vance met me at the docking bay, her uniform marked with the insignia of the Fleet Logistics Division. She had a tired but focused look about her, the kind that comes from working long hours on something you believe truly matters. "You're the one from Kepler's Rest," she said, not unkindly, as she led me through a corridor lined with status monitors. "Command wants you to see this, so you understand what your testimony set in motion. Most people never get to see this part." She brought me to an observation deck overlooking one of the primary construction bays, and I stood there in stunned silence as I took in the sight below. Massive drone frames, still and silent, filled row after row of the bay. Thousands of them, each one designed to replicate itself using raw materials mined directly from nearby asteroids. "These have been sitting in standby for almost 30 years, Natalie explained. "We call the program Long Watch. Most of the public was told it was an asteroid mining initiative. In truth, it was always meant for exactly this moment. A single activation order, and this entire fleet begins building itself, faster than any crewed shipyard ever could." I asked her the question that had been forming in my mind since Admiral Lawton's explanation back in the assembly chamber. Why keep something like this hidden for so long? Why not just tell everyone, so other powers would know not to try anything? Natalie considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because a weapon everyone knows about becomes a target," she said. "And because deterrence built on secrecy forces an aggressor to gamble blind. The Thessary Empire believed our public defense fleet was the whole of our strength. They believed our restraint over the last century was proof of limitation, not proof of choice. That mistake is the only reason any of this is possible now." Over the following days, I was given a kind of access most civilians would never receive, largely because Command wanted someone who had lived through the attack to carry an honest account back to the surviving population of Kepler's Rest, wherever they eventually resettled. I watched engineers activate stealth field generators built into hulls that had been sitting quietly disguised as commercial freighters for over a decade. I watched kinetic strike platforms, enormous and utterly silent, begin aligning themselves along firing solutions calculated years in advance for exactly this kind of situation. What struck me most was not the size of the weapons, though they were larger than anything I had imagined humanity possessed. It was the calm, methodical way everyone around me worked. There was no shouting. There was no chaotic scramble. Every action unfolded according to plans that had clearly been rehearsed, refined, and quietly maintained for decades by people who hoped, above everything else, that they would never actually need to use them. A young officer named Lucas Prentice, assigned to walk me through the Fleet Coordination Center, put it plainly one afternoon as we watched status boards fill with green markers representing ships coming online across a dozen different systems. Most of us joined the fleet, hoping this day would never come, he said. We trained for it because that's the job, but nobody wants to be right about something like this. I asked him what he thought would happen once the fleet reached full readiness. He looked at the board for a long moment before answering. I think the Thessari Empire is about to learn the difference between a species that avoids conflict out of fear and a species that avoids conflict out of choice, he said. Those two things look identical, right up until the moment they stop being identical. News of Earth's mobilization did not stay contained within human space for long. I was present during a briefing where fleet intelligence shared intercepted communications from several allied and neutral species, all of them reacting with a mixture of confusion and alarm as they detected the sudden, coordinated activation of installations they had never known existed. One representative from a neighboring trade alliance, a species called the Varan, sent a formal inquiry to Terran Command, asking, with evident unease, exactly what was happening across human territory. Admiral Lawton's response, which I was shown during a debrief, was short and direct. Humanity is exercising its right to respond to an unprovoked attack on one of its civilian worlds, the message read. No other territory is at risk. We ask that neutral parties remain outside the affected region until this matter has been resolved. I remember Natalie Vance reading that message over my shoulder and letting out a short, humorless laugh. They have no idea what's coming, she said. None of them do. Everyone out there has always seen humanity through the lens of our trade routes, and our colonies, and our careful diplomacy. Nobody outside a small circle of command ever saw what we built in case diplomacy failed. I asked her if she thought the wider galaxy would see us differently after this was over. I think they'll see us exactly as we are, she said. A species that prefers peace, but that has never once been the reason we've had peace. That reason has always been choice. After this, nobody will mistake the difference again. By the end of my third week at the Ceres shipyard, the Fleet Coordination Center reported that 80% of the Long Watch systems had reached full operational readiness, months ahead of even the most optimistic projections. I stood on the observation deck one final time before returning to Earth, watching an endless procession of warships depart in tight, disciplined formations, their hulls catching the distant light of the sun as they moved toward the outer edge of Sol territory and beyond. I thought of Kepler's Rest as I watched them go. I thought of Oliver, who had stayed behind at the resettlement center, unable to bring himself to watch any of this unfold in person. I thought of the old woman named Grace, who had passed peacefully in her sleep just days after we reached Earth, her body finally allowed to rest after carrying her through 3 days of fear. I thought of the 14,000 names that had been read aloud during the public memorial broadcast, each one taking a small, permanent piece of my attention as it passed. I did not feel joy watching that fleet depart. I do not think anyone who truly understood what was happening felt joy in that moment. What I felt instead was something quieter, and in some ways heavier. It was the feeling of watching a promise, made long before I was born, finally come due. Lucas Prentice found me still standing at the viewport long after most of the fleet had cleared the shipyard's boundary. He did not say much. He simply stood beside me for a while, watching the same empty space I was watching. "You did this," he finally said. "Not alone, but you carried the story that started it. I hope that means something to you. Someday, even if it doesn't feel like much right now." I did not answer him immediately. I only nodded, watching the last few ships vanish into the dark, carrying with them a promise that an empire far away was about to learn had never, not for a single day, been empty. I was not meant to be present for the counter-invasion. Civilian liaisons rarely were, but when Fleet Command learned that I had picked up conversational thesauri during my years working alongside trade inspectors on Kepler's Rest, a skill I had never once thought would matter beyond haggling over mineral shipments, I was asked to join a small forward team as a translator. I said yes before I even finished hearing the full request. We departed Sol territory nearly 2 months after the attack on my home, traveling aboard a support vessel that trailed several days behind the main strike fleet. By the time we arrived at the outer edge of Thesauri space, the war, if it could even be called that, was already unfolding exactly as Admiral Lawton and her staff had planned it. I want to be careful here, because I know how easy it would be to describe what happened next as simple destruction. It was not simple, and it was not without restraint, even though the scale of it was enormous. Terran forces did not scatter their attack across random targets. Every strike was aimed with precision at military infrastructure, shipyards, command centers, and defense installations. Civilian population centers across the Thesauri Empire received advance evacuation warnings whenever possible, broadcast through every channel fleet intelligence could access. Admiral Lawton had been clear about this from the beginning, and I heard her say it more than once during briefings I was allowed to attend. "We are not here to become what was done to Kepler's Rest," she said. "We are here to remove the ability of this empire to ever do it again. There is a difference, and I intend for history to see that difference clearly." Even with that restraint, the scale of what unfolded was staggering. Long-watch drone swarms, replicating themselves faster than Thesauri defenses could adapt, overwhelmed shipyard after shipyard across a dozen systems within the first 2 weeks. Kinetic strike platforms disabled orbital defense stations with a precision that left surrounding infrastructure largely untouched. Entire fleets that the Thesauri Empire had spent generations building were rendered inoperable in a matter of days, their command structures severed, their supply lines cut, their ability to coordinate any meaningful resistance stripped away almost before they understood what was happening to them. I served aboard a forward diplomatic shuttle whose task was to negotiate the surrender of individual Thesauri command outposts once their defenses had been neutralized. It was during one of these negotiations that I met a Thesauri fleet commander named Vorel Dasik, a name I still remember clearly because of the conversation that followed. Vorel had commanded a mid-sized defense station near the edge of Thesauri territory, one of dozens that had gone dark once Terran forces disabled its primary systems. When our shuttle docked to accept the formal surrender of his remaining crew, he requested to speak with the human translator directly, which was how I ended up standing across from him in a quiet, dimly lit command room, his posture rigid with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. "You are the one who speaks our language," he said, his translated voice carrying a flat, careful tone. "Then perhaps you can explain something to me that my own commanders never could." I told him I would try. "Your species allowed itself to be underestimated for over 100 years," he said. "Every report we received described humanity as cautious, restrained, unwilling to project force beyond the minimum necessary for self-defense. We believed this caution was born from limitation. We believed you lacked the capability to do what has now been done to our empire in a matter of weeks." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, though I could not fully read Thesauri features well enough to name the emotion precisely. "Tell me honestly," he said, "was this capability always present, waiting, while your species presented itself as harmless to the rest of the galaxy?" I answered him as truthfully as I could. "It was always there," I said. "Humanity chose peace because we wanted peace, not because we lacked any other option. That choice was real, but so was the promise behind it, that if any power ever attacked an undefended human world without provocation, that choice would end completely. Vorel was quiet for a long moment. Then the failure was ours, he finally said. We mistook restraint for weakness. We mistook patience for fear. It is, I believe, the oldest mistake any power can make when trying to understand a species it does not fully know. I asked him, carefully, whether he had known in advance that Kepler's rest was going to be attacked. No, he said, and something in his voice told me this, at least, was true. That decision came from a faction within our command structure that believed a demonstration of force against an undefended colony would discourage human expansion into contested territory. They believed humanity would respond with diplomatic protest, perhaps limited retaliation against military targets, nothing more. They did not believe your species capable of what has happened since. He looked directly at me then, and his next words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. They were wrong, and my empire is paying the full price of their miscalculation. I do not say this seeking forgiveness. I say it because I believe your species deserves to hear it plainly, from someone who now understands exactly what was taken from you, and exactly why nothing that has happened since should have surprised us. I did not know what to say to that. I simply thanked him for his honesty, and moved forward with the formal surrender protocols, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Over the following month, I traveled between several more Thessari command outposts as their defenses fell one after another, always in the same methodical, disciplined pattern. Terran forces did not linger to occupy captured territory. They did not seize resources, claim new colonies, or expand human territory into the space they had cleared. Every operation followed the same clear objective: disable the Empire's capacity to wage war, and then withdraw once that objective had been achieved. I asked Admiral Lawton about this directly during one of the rare moments she visited our forward position, curious why humanity was not simply claiming the vast territory now left undefended. Because that was never the point, she said. If we take their territory, we become exactly what the galaxy has always feared humanity might become: another empire building itself through violence. We are not here to grow. We are here to prove that a line, once drawn, means exactly what it says, nothing more and nothing less. By the 10th week of the campaign, the Thessari Empire's central command structure had effectively collapsed. Their capital fleet, once considered among the most powerful in the region, had been reduced to a fraction of its former size, its remaining vessels grounded under strict Terran oversight. Their ability to project military force beyond their own home system had been entirely removed, just as the doctrine Admiral Lawton described back in the assembly chamber had always promised. I stood aboard the observation deck of our forward vessel during the final formal surrender ceremony, watching Thessari officials sign documents that would strip their empire of any offensive military capability for at least a generation, under continuous verification by a small, permanent Terran monitoring presence. Vorel Dasik was present at that ceremony as well, standing among the surviving Thessari command staff. As the proceedings ended and officials began to disperse, he approached me one final time. "I do not expect your species to forgive what was done to your colony," he said. "I do not believe forgiveness was ever the purpose of what has happened here. But I want you to know that what remains of my people now understands, completely, why that promise existed in the first place, and why it will never again be mistaken for an empty threat." I thought of Kepler's rest as he spoke. I thought of the grain tower folding sideways into rubble, of the lake turned the color of rust, of 14,000 names read aloud during a memorial broadcast that had reached every corner of human space. I did not feel triumph standing there. I felt something closer to a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes after holding your breath for far longer than you thought you could. "I hope," I finally said to him, "that no one ever has to learn this lesson again." He did not respond right away. He simply nodded once, a gesture I had come to understand over the months of working alongside Thessari officials as their version of quiet, genuine agreement. Behind him, through the wide viewport of our forward vessel, I could see the dim outline of the Thessari homeworld, its cities intact, its people frightened but alive, spared the fate that had been dealt to my own home only because Terran Command had chosen, deliberately and carefully, to draw a clear line between justice and cruelty. It was a line I would come to understand far more deeply in the months that followed, once the fighting had ended and the slow, quiet work of what came after finally began. 3 years passed before I finally returned to Kepler's Rest, and I want to describe what I found there, because it was not what I expected, even after everything I had witnessed in between. The Thessari Empire, once one of the largest military powers in our region of space, no longer existed in any form capable of threatening another world. What remained of it had reorganized under a new civilian government, one supervised closely by a small Terran oversight mission, though not controlled by it. Admiral Lawton had been firm about that distinction from the very beginning, and I had come to understand, over time, exactly why it mattered so much to her. "If we rule them, we become their enemy forever," she told me once, during a quiet conversation aboard the transport that eventually carried me home. "If we simply remove their ability to harm others and then step back, we give them the chance to become something else. That choice is theirs to make, not ours to force." I learned, during my final visit to the region before returning to Sol territory, that the Thessari homeworld had chosen, entirely on its own, to convert one of its central districts into a memorial dedicated to the victims of Kepler's Rest. I did not expect this. I do not think anyone did. Vorel Dasik, who had gone on to serve within the new civilian government, sent word of the memorial's dedication through official channels, along with a personal message inviting any survivors who wished to attend. I did not go. I was not ready, and I do not think I needed to be. But I heard, secondhand, that the memorial listed all 14,000 names, translated carefully into Thessari script, standing beside a simple inscription that read, in both languages, "A line drawn is a promise kept." Earth itself changed as well, though not in the way I imagined some had expected. There was no triumphant celebration, no parades marking the fall of an empire. Admiral Lawton addressed the Terran Assembly one final time before stepping back from active command, and I was present for that address, standing quietly near the back of the chamber where I had once given my own testimony 3 years earlier. "We did not do this because we wanted power," she said. "We did this because we made a promise long before any of us were born, and because a species that breaks its own promises the first time they become costly is a species that will eventually break every promise it makes. Kepler's Rest paid a price no colony should ever have to pay. I hope, more than anything else in my long career, that no world ever has to pay it again." The wider galaxy did change how it saw humanity after that, though not in the dramatic, sweeping way some had predicted. Trade negotiations with neighboring species grew more careful, more respectful, though never openly fearful. I met with representatives from the Varan Alliance during a diplomatic function nearly 2 years after the campaign ended, and one of their senior negotiators, an older woman named Ellen Korvath, admitted something to me quietly over a shared meal. "We always assumed your species avoided conflict because you were afraid of it," she said. "We understand now that you avoided it because you chose to, and that the choice could end at any time certain lines were crossed. It changes how a species negotiates, knowing that." I asked her if that made her afraid of humanity. "No," she said, after a moment's thought. "It makes me respect the line, and respect that you have never once moved it since. That is worth more, in the long run, than fear ever could be." During that same diplomatic function, I met a young Thessari attaché named Ren Solvek, part of the new civilian government's outreach mission to human space. He was young by Thessari standards, born after the campaign had already ended, and he approached me with a kind of careful curiosity rather than the guarded distance I had grown used to from older Thessari officials. "I have read the recorded testimony from the assembly chamber many times," he told me. "I have studied the campaign in my history courses, but I have never spoken with someone who actually lived through the night it began." I asked him what his generation had been taught about what happened. "That a faction within our old command structure made a catastrophic miscalculation," he said, "and that the Empire paid for it with everything it had built over 2 centuries. We are taught to understand why the response came, not simply that it came. I think that distinction matters more than anything else they could have taught us. I found some quiet comfort in that answer. It told me that whatever had been lost could not be entirely undone, but that the reason behind it had not been erased or softened into something easier to accept. The truth had survived, plainly, on both sides of what had happened. I eventually returned to Kepler's Rest myself, nearly 3 years to the day after the attack that had taken it from us. The Terran government had rebuilt a small portion of the original colony grounds, not as a new settlement, but as a permanent memorial garden, open to any survivor who wished to visit, and to anyone else who wished to understand what had happened there. Claire came with me. She had grown into someone stronger than I think either of us expected, working now as a counselor for other survivors of colony conflicts across human space. Her own grief transformed slowly into something that helped other people carry theirs. We walked together through rows of quiet stone markers, each one bearing a name, arranged not by rank or importance, but simply in the order the original colony census had once listed its residents. I found our old neighbors listed there. I found teachers I remembered from childhood. I found the family of Oliver Bennett, the pilot who had saved 9 of us that night, though Oliver himself had chosen, eventually, to settle far from any reminder of what he had witnessed, and I did not blame him for that choice. Near the center of the memorial garden stood a single, simple marker, larger than the rest, bearing no name at all. Instead, it carried the same inscription I had heard was placed on the Thessari homeworld, translated now into every language spoken across human space. A line drawn is a promise kept. Not far from that marker, I found a smaller stone bearing the names of everyone who had once worked at the water reclamation station on the eastern ridge, the place where I had spent my mornings before the sky ever caught fire. I recognized every name listed there. I had shared meals with some of them. I had argued over shift schedules with others. Seeing their names carved into permanent stone, arranged in the same order we used to line up for morning briefings, brought back a wave of memory so sharp that I had to stop walking for a moment and simply breathe. Claire waited beside me without speaking, giving me the space I needed, the same way I had once given her space during the long, silent hours aboard that shuttle 3 years earlier. When I finally continued walking, she slipped her hand back into mine, and neither of us said anything more for a long while. We stayed at the memorial garden until the light began to fade, watching as a few other survivors arrived quietly to visit names of their own. An older man knelt beside a marker near the edge of the garden, resting his palm flat against the stone the way someone might rest a hand on a sleeping child. A young woman traced letters with her fingertip, her lips moving silently, perhaps saying a name out loud one final time before turning to leave. None of us spoke to each other directly. There was an unspoken understanding among everyone who visited that ground, a shared knowledge that words were not always necessary, that simply standing together in the presence of what had been lost was its own quiet form of company. Standing there, near the center of the memorial garden, Claire's hand in mine, remembering the night the sky over Kepler's Rest had turned the color of fire, remembering the shuttle ride with 9 strangers, who became something like family in the space of 3 desperate days, remembering Admiral Lawton's quiet certainty in a chamber full of frightened officials, remembering Vorel Dassik's honest admission that his empire had simply never understood who they were truly facing. I thought about the promise that had carried us through all of it, a promise made over a century before I was born, kept not out of anger, but out of a discipline so old it had become part of what it meant to be human among the stars. I do not know what the future holds for humanity, or for the empires and alliances that now watch us with a mixture of respect and careful distance. I only know that somewhere out among those quiet stone markers, 14,000 names remain permanently written into the history of what happens when a promise, however old, however quiet, is finally tested. I hope no other world ever has to learn that lesson the way mine did. But I know now, without any doubt, that if it ever happens again, the promise will still be there, waiting, exactly as it was the night the sky first caught fire over Kepler's Rest.